So with my last video covering Final Fantasy X-2, I was all caught up with the 10 series, meaning that it was time for me to move on from the world of Spira. And I gotta tell you guys, when I transitioned from 13 to 10, from Lightning to Titus, it was very difficult, especially after playing 3 whole games. It was like continuing watching Doctor Who after your favorite doctor regenerates into a new face. Any Doctor Who fans out there, you know the feeling. Anyway, after playing 2 games, you're damn sure I developed some attachment to 10, and I was just not quite ready to adjust to a whole other mainline universe once again. So I chose to play the spin-off game, World of Final Fantasy. Something a little more lighthearted that features characters that I'm familiar with. I'd also thought it'd make for an interesting topic because I don't see that much discussion about this game. Based on most of the comments I get, you guys have played the mainline games and its sequels, but how about this one? If you have played it, let me know your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious because this is the first Final Fantasy game in a while where I had no knowledge of its critical reception going into it. But without further ado, let's take a look at World of Final Fantasy. So starting from the beginning, the game opens up with 2 siblings, Rain and Lan, waking up in the world of Ninewood Hills one day to find that the streets are completely empty. It's an absolute ghost town and there's only one other person present. Anna Crow, who claims to be God, and a talking fox named Tama. The 2 of them explain to the siblings that it has always just been the 2 of them in this world, and they have lost all their memories as Mirage Keepers. People who have the ability to tame and control creatures known as Mirages. However, if they can recover their Mirages, they may be able to regain those memories and perhaps meet their lost family. I know guys, bear with me here. So guided by Anna Crow and with Tama by their side, the 2 siblings set out on an adventure in another world known as Grimoire, a world full of mirages to do just those things. That's this game's setup, and I gotta say this is the most awkward, inorganic setup for a game that I can remember playing. Just to get the one major negative I have with this game out of the way, the plot is the weakest aspect of World of Final Fantasy. The whole game is essentially Rain and Lan traveling across Grimoire, collecting mirages and artifacts in hopes of recalling their past lives. And I don't mind when the overall goal of the protagonist is simple and constant throughout the entire game. The problem here is it's kinda inspired out of thin air. The game doesn't give players much reason to be invested in this adventure because everything our main heroes are doing are not based on anything concrete. They're blindly doing as they're told. The story doesn't begin with them struggling with their memory loss, they are enlightened by it.
And if you keep on gathering mirages, I think you might even meet your family in due time.
Our family?
Huh? Well, I guess. It does make sense that we'd have parents.
Their journey is centered around discovering things that didn't even cross their minds when the game started. And I don't imagine players' investment will grow any further as the game goes on because it never provides any idea what their lives were like. Not anything through flashbacks or dialogue of the siblings reminiscing because they have no memories. And once the cat's out of the bag towards the end, there's not as much of an emotional payoff as there should be because again, there's barely any establishment of their past lives, their family throughout most of the story. But having said all that, this should not significantly hinder the ability to enjoy this game because you're most likely just in it for all of its Final Fantasy glory. Grimoire is not just a land of mirages, which are Final Fantasy monsters. It is a conglomerate of Final Fantasy locations inhabited by Final Fantasy characters. As Rain and Lan are working towards their grand goal, their journey will consist of lots of smaller story arcs dealing with classic Final Fantasy heroes. Which means in order to get the most out of this experience, it's best to be familiar with almost all the Final Fantasy games leading up to this title. The first Final Fantasy character the siblings come across is Princess Sarah from the very original Final Fantasy. I've never played that game, so there wasn't any emotion from me there, but not too long after, I ran into another major Final Fantasy character and I was like, and eventually another character showed up and I was like, this game is fan service galore, with tons of returning characters with their respective voice actors, references.
It makes me just want to laugh out loud.
I have no idea how to react to that.
I do. I understood that reference.
Now before you're like, oh, I haven't played that many Final Fantasy, so this isn't gonna be cool for me, the game doesn't entirely rely on the fan service to be enjoyable. This game only features 3 Final Fantasy universes that I'm familiar with. 3 out of what? 13? I'm sure so many things went right over my head playing this, but I still thoroughly had a good time because the characters that we constantly follow are not overshadowed by already beloved characters that only come and go. Even though I said I'm not too keen on what provoked our characters to embark on their adventure, they're really fun characters nonetheless. Their banter is amazing. It's the sibling dynamic where the brother is kind of a goofball, not the brightest individual, and the sister who's a little more mature is constantly annoyed with them. Then you also got the talking animal companion contributing to that. Sometimes Tama will have side conversations with Rain about how much of an idiot Lon is.
Huh? Hang on. What was I going to do to you again?
Hey, don't look at me.
Then tell me what you know.
Huh? Nobody asks me that.
Which of them will out the stupid the other? I can't but look away.
Mm-hmm.
And other times she will be goofing off with Lon.
We're outnumbered, Kupo.
Now what, Kupo?
Stop saying Kupo and fight, Kupo. Oops. Huh?
There's only one thing to do now, Kupo.
Get him, the Kupo.
Guys, we're not here to have fun.
And...
We're not here to have fun, Kupo.
better.
Much the better.
They're a blast to follow. There were a good number of times where the dialogue actually made me chuckle. And not just between these three, the Final Fantasy characters as well. Which is why I don't think it's necessarily required to be acquainted with them to enjoy their presence. Also, the game is just quite fun to play. It's pretty much Pokemon Final Fantasy Edition. There are other Final Fantasy games that have Pokemon elements, but this is straight up Pokemon. In Grimoire, you're going to be traversing through many different regions, towns, dungeons, battling and capturing all sorts of Mirages to use in battle. What's a little unique here though is that each Mirage has a certain criteria that needs to be met before you can attempt to capture. For example, some require you to attack it with a certain elemental attack, others need to be inflicted with a status ailment, and regardless of what the criteria is, you're more likely to have a successful capture if the Mirage's health is low. Just like Pokemon. Once that's checked off, you throw a Prismarium at them, which is the equivalent to a Pokeball, and after 3 ticks, you're good to go. You can nickname them, ride them, have them be your HM slave. I can go on with the similarities. But another thing that's a bit different is the Mirages fight alongside you rather than for you. This game has a mechanic called stacking, where characters and monsters literally stack on top of each other, combining their stats into one powerful unit, with shared abilities based on the characters within that stack. You'll find enemies doing this as well, making for more powerful opponents. A stack can have up to 3 characters and is arranged by size. Large characters go in the bottom, medium size in the middle, and small on top. Now everyone in the world of Grimoire are chibis. Rain and Lon are not. They're special. They're considered giants, but they have the ability to transform into chibis to blend in under your control. When they're giants, they are large-sized characters. So in order for them to stack in that form, they would have to be in the bottom, followed by a medium-sized Mirage on top, followed by a small Mirage above that. Their chibi form, on the other hand, is medium-sized, so they would have to be in between a large and small Mirage. Now, as you're leveling up your Mirages, you'll also be able to eventually evolve them. They'll become stronger and be able to learn abilities their prior form can't. What's interesting though is that you don't always want to evolve a Mirage every chance you get. You see, when a Mirage evolves, they get bigger. So let's say you evolve a medium-sized Mirage within one of your setups. That Mirage will then become a large monster, forcing you to adjust your setup in which you already may be content with. So ultimately, there are both pros and cons of evolving, and it's up to your discretion in doing so. You're very free to experiment though, because another neat feature is that you can devolve Mirages if that's more ideal for your setup. You're going to be able to set up stacks for each of the siblings' forms for a total of 4 stack setups, and the setups you'll be going into battle with will depend on whether you had Rain and Lon appear as giants or chibis in the overworld before engaging in them. With all that, let's talk about the actual combat. So this game can actually be either full-on turn-based or active time battle. You can set it to whichever you prefer in the settings. I chose to just leave it at default, which is turn-based. It's nice that they have both options though, for those who find turn-based too slow. Now in my video on Final Fantasy X, I said that I wasn't a fan of turn-based combat. At least, that's what I thought. I had a much better time with it in this game, and that's because this game was simply overall far less frustrating. I'm further learning that everything I took issue with in Final Fantasy X would have been absolutely fine by themselves. Like, this game still has one of those monsters that retaliates with some ability after it's defeated, dealing a crap ton of damage without any warning, and it killed me. Bullshit. But that's okay, because I learned from it and the game didn't take me back 10 chapters and force me to rewatch cutscenes. Final Fantasy X did. It stacked all of these things together, making one big piece of shit. But I digress. So in battle, characters take turns based on agility. The faster a character, the sooner they get to act. That's a no-brainer when it comes to turn-based combat, however, I really like how that's visually shown in this game. On the left side of the screen, there's gonna be icons of each character in battle cycling through a vertical bar. Whenever a character's icon reaches the top of the bar, it would be their turn to perform an action. With this feature, you're able to see how much faster or slower characters are compared to each other when watching their icons race to the top. You'll also be able to see the effects of haste and slow, as the character's icons would move more quickly or slowly depending on which spell was casted on them. And sometimes the speed gap would be so large characters would overlap others, being able to make consecutive actions. I dig this. It adds more visual engagement to a combat style that I wasn't initially fond of. Now, aside from performing basic attacks and abilities with your stacked characters, some variation to the combat includes calling out Mirages that are extra large, which essentially act as party swapping summons. In addition to that, there's these special medals you'll be able to use to summon champions, which are well-known Final Fantasy heroes to either buff up your stats or deal massive damage to your opponents with a flashy animation. I absolutely love it. My only gripe with the combat is that it doesn't provide enough of a challenge to provoke any critical thinking whatsoever. All you really need to do to win battles is attack and heal whenever you need to. Even with the tougher enemies that are tankier and hit harder, all they do is draw out battles and force you to manage your health more often. It's unfortunate because the difficulty curve really undermines a lot of this game's mechanics. Like, for additional strategy, certain attacks can cause stacks to topple, making them break into multiple weaker units for easy pickings. However, I found this rarely a necessity to do. It's not much less convenient to just defeat enemies while they're stacked. And as cool as the champions are, I would have gone through the game just fine without them, with the exception of a very few instances. Most of the time when I summoned a champion or used a Mirage's AoE ability, it was to save me time by ending battles more quickly rather than save my rear. It's also not all that important to strategize with your stack setup in terms of what Mirages to use despite them sharing their strengths and weaknesses when stacked. I just welcomed any Mirage I found appealing, which I guess is kind of a double-edged sword because I did appreciate that the game was easy enough for me to use any Mirage I want. It's really a matter of personal preference. If you're solely looking for a game that will challenge you, you'll probably find this game extremely mundane, but the difficulty shouldn't be too much of a problem for more casual players who just want to have a good time. So that's mostly what you can expect from World of Final Fantasy. A lot of the optional content are just more battles in different contexts. Like, you'll occasionally run into NPCs asking you to slay monsters for them. There's these cubes spread out throughout Grimoire called Merc Rifts that can take you to a pocket dimension to battle tougher Mirages. Although these aren't very exciting on their own, they're a part of an already enjoyable game. You got a Pokemon-esque game where you follow a very likable trio through this beautifully designed Final Fantasy world. Honestly, what further drew me in was this game's art style, the visual aesthetic. I'm talking about the chibi art too. Everyone is tiny, but some Final Fantasy characters maintain their hard-edged personalities and it's just adorable. Probably the most compelling side content in this game are the intervention quests. They're special missions that can be accessed in this particular room without time, where you can discreetly tap into the souls of Final Fantasy characters you met along the journey to see what they're up to. Pretty much all of them involve a battle that you engage in on their behalf, and your victory is essentially theirs. They're fun little side stories that you can explore if you're interested. What I greatly appreciate about this game though is how it implements its in-game features and mechanics into the actual story. For instance, whenever you lose a fight, which will probably happen from time to time, this game's not that easy. You return to Ninewood Hills, the world where the story of this game begins. It's essentially the hub world where you can replenish items and all that good stuff. Anyway, it's explained that each time Rain and Lan are defeated in battle, Tama has the power to rewind time a little to save them by giving up one of her many lives. And I was like, alright, that's a little gimmick the game has to replace the typical game overs. But this actually comes into play in the story later on, and I was like, okay, that's actually quite clever. The game does this multiple times. There's gonna be features where you're not gonna think much of, and then it becomes crucial to the main story. Despite how shallow the overall narrative is, there is some clever storytelling here, particularly at the end. The story peaks once the game ends. And I don't mean that like, oh, the story's so bad, the best part's when it's over. No. Without directly spoiling it, let's just say this game ends like Infinity War, and the post-game content is endgame. There's heavy story content in the post-game, and it made the narrative of this game. As always, there's plenty of things that I haven't touched upon, but that's about everything I found most notable in World of Final Fantasy, and it's certainly something special. As a spin-off game that was looked past by a lot of people, it deserves so much more attention because to me, not only is it a solid Final Fantasy spin-off, it has the quality to rival mainline titles. The thing with this game was, it didn't need to be some incredible cathartic experience that will challenge me emotionally. It just had to be an entertaining fan service fest, and it very much is. I loved being able to see my favorite Final Fantasy characters again, and I loved seeing iconic characters from different universes teaming up like they're the damn Avengers. Not to mention that this surrounds a game that already focuses on likable newcomers and is quite delightful to play on its own. As for the story, even though I didn't find any merit until the very end, it was never a drag due to everything else I just mentioned. Overall, it's a cute, charming game. You can't really hate it. I feel like this is a game that you either like to an extent or just haven't played it because it didn't interest you. I would find it baffling for someone that's familiar with Final Fantasy to play this and straight up not like it. Usually when I play an older game and like it this much, I would say that I would have been happy getting it day one, but for this particular game, it wouldn't have landed the same way it did with me playing it now. This is a game that I would recommend to any Final Fantasy fan. Whether you're a fan that has only played 2 other entries or all of them, I don't doubt this game has something for you. Despite being out for 6 years now, it's still up to date, featuring characters from FF games up to the latest mainline title, with Noctis being DLC. Not for long though, as Final Fantasy 16 is coming around the corner next year. Hopefully. So if you haven't played World of Final Fantasy, what better time to play it than now if you're interested. It's not a perfect game by any means, but it is a perfect love letter to Final Fantasy fans.